Hello, and welcome to today's conversation. So you decided to go multi-cloud. Now what? I'm Bennett Richardson, president of Protocol. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our partners at HashiCorp for making today's event possible. At Protocol, we aim to arm you as decision makers in technology, business, and policy with actionable news and analysis to help you do your job. It's never been easier to use multiple cloud providers for modern tech infrastructure needs. But should you go multi-cloud? In this event, we'll hear from a panel of experts on the arguments for and against multi-cloud computing and how businesses should think about their options as the market evolves. We're so glad you could tune in today. If you're not already subscribed, don't forget to sign up for Protocol Enterprise and Protocol's family of newsletters at protocol.com/newsletters. To kick things off, I'm excited to bring up Armon Dadgar for an executive conversation on what organizations can expect as they consider the transition to multi-cloud. Armon's the co-founder and chief technology officer of HashiCorp, an infrastructure software company working to help organizations seamlessly transition to and operate in the cloud. As a former engineer himself, Armon has worked on the design and implementation of many of the core HashiCorp products, often to solve the end user problems that he experienced firsthand. Welcome, Armon.
Thanks so much, Bennett. Excited to be here.
Would love your help sort of setting the stage here on this multi-cloud topic. Can you explain to us why are companies shifting to using multiple cloud providers?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it can be a very polarizing one if you pay attention to the Twitter discourse on it. I think our realistic view of it is oftentimes you don't choose multi-cloud. What I like to joke is that multi-cloud chooses you. And I think the reason for that is, as a large enterprise, I think it's particularly the larger you get, the more this applies. There's a lot of different drivers to your choice of vendor, right? Part of it might be, hey, you're in a regulated space like a bank, and you have a regulatory regime that says, sorry, you can't go to cloud unless you prove to me that you can be in multiple cloud providers, right? That's a very realistic scenario with a lot of different regulated spaces where a regulator tells me, too bad, you have to be multi-cloud, right? On the other hand, you have multinationals that operate around the world. They need to have access to regions that are local. Sometimes that's China, for example, and they need to be with Ali Cloud or, a local Chinese cloud. Other times they need, a Switzerland local thing, or great, that might only be Azure, but the rest of your infrastructure is AWS. So, there's a compelling reason to do that. I think a third reason is M&A, right? At a certain scale, you might be all in on one provider. You buy a company who's on a different provider. Welcome to multi-cloud, right? And kind of the list goes on, right? Whether it's driven by regulatory reasons, driven by M&A, driven by differentiated capability, right? I think it used to be, if we went back to 2010, it was sort of, you could say squint and say, hey, they're all IaaS providers. Where now, there are billions of dollars of investment ahead. There's a differentiated set of AI ML capability that, Google has. There's a differentiated set of developer services Amazon has. There's a differentiated set of Microsoft middleware Azure provides. So it's like, if you want access to those best of breed capabilities, you sort of have to be multi-cloud. And I think the last one is people have been in a single vendor situation where they're all in on, let's say, one database provider, and it comes time for their license renewal time. And all of a sudden they realize, oh, wow, we have very little leverage in this negotiation. Our pricing has gone up astronomically and there's nowhere for us to go. So I think a lot of vendors are wary, whether they've been there with their database vendor, whether they've been there with computing platforms before, that they don't want to be in a single vendor situation where they have no leverage when it comes to renewal, right? So I think there's a lot of these different drivers, but all of them kind of bring you to multi-cloud as your practical reality. And so I think for us, that's what we've seen with our customer interaction is really over the last 18, 24 months. I think CIOs everywhere are sort of acknowledging that, yeah, multi-cloud is my pragmatic reality.
It's a great way to think about it, that pragmatic reality for all the reasons you described. The role that you all play in the space, obviously you're a leader in infrastructure automation. That infrastructure needs are so important for multi-cloud environments. We'd love to maybe fast forward, into actually the implementation here. So as companies are making this shift and rolling out a multi-cloud approach, what are some of the areas that are most impacted, and what are some of those aspects that stay the same?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think what we often see as people start going multi-cloud is, it's so often we've kind of clouded cloud 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 motion. In sort of the cloud 1.0 motion, what we see people do is basically say, great, I'm going to stand up an enterprise agreement with my preferred cloud provider. I'm going to give access keys to my developers and say sort of run free. And what you end up realizing is almost inevitably 12 months later, 15 months later, someone in the CIO organization or someone in the CISO organization starts setting off the alarm bell, which is like, what we have is total chaos, right? We've enabled 50 or 100 applications to go to cloud. They're all doing it in a different way. There's a total lack of central governance. We have cost overruns, which is the CIO's problem. We have security issues left and right, which is the CISO's problem. And so you see those groups say, hey, hit pause. Right. And so from there, you move from kind of a 1.0 into what we consider sort of a 2.0, where companies start to say, okay, maybe it shouldn't be the Wild West in terms of how we approach cloud. What we actually need to do is define sort of a platform team or a central cloud team that defines what's the foundational approach to going to cloud, right? Because we're going to define accounts in a consistent way. We're going to put security policy in a consistent way. We're going to sort of constrain the aperture so that all of the application teams are going to cloud in a consistent way. And that gives some aspect of day two control, whether it's over cost or security or compliance, to sort of manage it at scale. So that motion becomes what we call kind of that cloud 2.0, and it's the establishment of the platform team or the cloud team to bring that central kind of aperture. And then I think at scale, when that's sort of effective, it leads to kind of the cloud 3.0, which is, okay, now that I have the centralized approach to my sort of single cloud, how do I expand that approach to apply to either a multi-cloud strategy, or oftentimes what we see is even bringing it back to private data centers, right? Which is you start to squint and say, why can't I treat my private data center the same way I treat my cloud and sort of automate it end to end? And to us, that becomes almost that cloud 3.0, which is you're sort of industrializing, not cloud as an infrastructure, but as a way of working, right? And say, how do I bring that cloud way of working back into sort of the private data center? So I think that tends to be sort of a very common motion we see in terms of like, how do you actually operationalize it? From a team perspective, it's establishing the right org structure, right? That central team to kind of, manage it. And then I think that leads into a tooling question of like, how do I actually do this in kind of a consistent way?
Got it. That's super helpful. And I like your thinking there on the 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. You laid out that rollout and those different levels for us. As we move over to the panel, I think it would be great to hear from you. You work with so many customers and companies transitioning into this multi-cloud way of working. Talk to us about best practices. How should organizations, think about this, and what should they do to really approach multi-cloud most successfully?
Yeah, no, I think the best thing is, going into it eyes wide open, as opposed to sort of walking into it, eyes wide shut, which is what we often see. And what I mean by that is being just really intentional about, what does this look like at scale? I think oftentimes people are so kind of obsessed over, hey, how do we kind of show traction over the next 3 months? They don't really pause to think, what does this look like in 18 months when I have 100 application teams doing it, right? Because I think if you start with that end vision and then work backward, you start to say, okay, what really matters is I need to have leverage in my approach, right? I can't have 100 teams re-implement the same pipelines, the same security controls, the same compliance controls. I should define that through a central platform approach and strategy so that all my 100 teams inherit it. Number two is from a tooling perspective, how do I think about doing it in a consistent way, right? So what we talk about at HashiCorp all the time is the notion of a cloud operating model, which is what I don't want to do is have 5 different tool chains, one unique per environment. Like this is my Amazon way of doing it, my VMware way of doing it, my Google way of doing it. Because now you've created an operational nightmare for your teams, which is like you have to enable everyone in 5 different tool chains. You have to implement security and compliance controls 5 different ways. So you've created a ton of just operational drag on the business. So that's how I really think about it is, how do you think about what team structure you need to put in place to get that leverage at scale? How do you think about what tooling you're going to use so that you have a consistency of sort of workflow as you're operating at scale? And really start from where you think you're going to end up and work backwards to what the roadmap needs to be. Because otherwise, I think it's really easy to just do the thing that's right in front of you. And then you wake up and you're like, I have 100 teams that did it 100 different ways with 10 different tool sets. And that becomes an operational nightmare.
Totally. Well, we obviously want to avoid that nightmare. And I think your point about being proactive about that roadmap is super smart and a great way to think about it. Thank you again, Armon, for joining us today, for those fascinating insights to kick off the conversation, and of course to HashiCorp for your partnership on today's event. My pleasure. Thanks so much for hosting us. Of course. Now I'm excited to bring up our panel. I'm going to hand it over to our moderator today, Protocol Enterprise Editor Tom Krazit, to introduce our panel and kick things off. So, Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Bennett. And thank you all for being here today. My name is Tom Krazit. I'm the Enterprise Editor. for Protocol and Protocol Enterprise, and we're joined today by a great panel of experts on cloud and really the entire history of the way that companies have had to evolve their IT infrastructure strategies with all the promise that the cloud presents, but all the real world problems that accompany such a journey. So just to kick things off, I'd like to ask our panel to introduce themselves. And Priyanka, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Tom, for having me. Hello, everybody. I'm Priyanka Sharma, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. For those who may not have heard of CNCF, or Cloud Native Computing Foundation, we are the home for critical infrastructure projects today, such as Kubernetes, Prometheus, Envoy, and 100 plus others. I am very thrilled to be here to speak with other luminaries from the space. Thank you.
We also have Paul Cormier from Red Hat. Paul, if you want to say.
Thank you, Tom. My name's Paul Cormier. I'm the president and CEO of Red Hat. So I've been involved with Linux, and which is the driver for most of what we do today. I've been involved for a long time. I've been at Red Hat for about 21 years. So I'm really happy to be here. I think Armon had some great points that I'm sure we're going to elaborate on. Things we see every single day with our customers.
And David.
Yep, Dave Linthicum. I'm the chief cloud geek at Deloitte, focused primarily on advanced architectures. So I'm the guy looking forward into the future and figuring out what the next steps are going to be.
And thank you all again for being here. So unfortunately, Armon stole all our great stuff, so we're just going to have to end this really quick. But I did want to start off today getting into something that Armon touched on, but I think that you all have unique perspectives on as well, is why companies find themselves in a place where they have decided that multi-cloud is the way they want to go. What are some of the most prominent reasons why people decide to do this? Is it something where they just kind of find themselves, they wake up one day and they've got 3 cloud providers on their payroll, or is it a more strategic thing, with some of the newer tools that are available these days? And I just encourage you to jump in with your thoughts as they come up.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and hit that first. I thought Armon was spot on. I mean, you don't adopt multi-cloud, it adopts you, because typically people just kind of morph and evolve into it. And so in other words, they may have had the idea to leverage a single public cloud provider 3 or 4 years ago. And now with the whole notion of best of breed, in other words, leveraging the best AI technology, the best analytics technology, the best databases, things like that, they start moving to different cloud brands. And they do that in the infrastructure as a service space. And so there's typically 2 or 3 of those that exist within the major enterprise, whether the CIO knows it or not. In other words, many of these things are projects that kind of happen in the background. They're shadow IT, things like that. Also, the consumption and use of software as a service providers are starting to mix in there as well. We have industry clouds that are popping up, verticalized applications. People are leveraging things as data assets and data resources. So ultimately, this is really about the evolution of technology, and this follows the patterns that we've been following for the last 40 years. Things get complex, things get very heterogeneous. People leverage whatever technology they're looking to leverage as a force multiplier, and that's going to lead to this complexity in different types of architectures.
100% agree.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Priyanka. No, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I 100% agree that to both David and Armon's points. And I see multi-cloud, and some people call it multi-hybrid cloud. Some people see hybrid cloud as the superset of it all. All of this is an inevitability. And when to your point, Tom, is it, do people wake up one day and realize that they have multiple cloud providers versus a strategic approach? I think it's a mix of both. It's kind of more of a spectrum, in my opinion, where, if you have both of these things on either side, people mostly are somewhere in the middle. There is some pre-planning, strategic effort going on. And then to David's point, there's a lot of shadow IT and things that have just sprawled over the years with folks choosing, ultimately, innovation, right? That's what developers everywhere, DevOps professionals everywhere are choosing, the best they can find to ultimately deliver software faster and better. So multi-cloud's here, it's always going to be here, and we are now just getting smarter about how to manage that.
This is Paul. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said here. I mean, hybrid multi is here. I mean, what David and Armon touched on a bit, Priyanka as well. I mean, it does come to you, but there's also some deliberate moves towards multi-cloud as well, as Armon highlighted, whether it be from regulation or data requirements, things like that. But I also see more and more customers that say, okay, I may be going in on this provider for now, but I don't want to be locked in. So I'm also going to leave my options open for this other cloud provider down the road. We see that a lot. The other thing that I thought was interesting that Armon brought up as well was, I think he called it Cloud version 3, where even starting to bring applications back and say on-premise. Cloud is not necessarily just a platform. It's a way of working. So I want to be cloud native. I want to have cloud native development on my on-premise as well, because there's a whole host of applications that may be required to be on-premise for the same set of reasons, data security requirements, etc. So having that flexibility is really, really important, and I think you can only get that if you think about it going in. So I think a lot of that's been said. But I think it's really important to reemphasize that. It's a little of both. It's a little it comes to you, but there's also now more and more deliberate movement to multi and hybrid. I also think in the beginning, a lot of customers of ours thought it was going to be really easy. Hey, we have major customers, major banks that I can tell you 5 or 6 years ago saying, I'm going 95% of my applications to one cloud in 5 years. We're 5 or 6, we're 10 years down the 14 years down the road of cloud. And I think depending on what survey you look like, it's 25, 30% of apps. Sure, it's going up, but it's complex to get there. It's powerful, but complex.
I want to come back to a couple of things that Paul just mentioned, especially the question of lock-in. But just before we get down that road, one thing, if I'm kind of curious about, in your conversations with customers and with partners and vendors across the industries, as people are finding themselves in this situation where multi-cloud is finding them, what are some things they wished they had known before it found them? Anything that could have helped them, lessons learned the hard way, I guess, or, things that, people for whom multi-cloud has yet to find them, what would they need? What would they want to know?
Yeah, I can kick that off. I think the big thing we find is the complexity. And so in other words, they went from managing 1,500 cloud services with a single cloud provider, and then they added another cloud service and another cloud service. Suddenly they have close to 5,000 very heterogeneous, very different services that they have to leverage and manage. And so we're looking at an ops budget that's really kind of triple of what it was with their on-premise systems, having to keep the skills around to manage these particular very different systems, have very sophisticated ways to do it, and also different silos of management within those things. And so the ability to get to some sort of an abstraction and automation to remove a lot of that complexity really kind of seems to be the path that everyone's taking now. And I think that, and actually the AI ops world is calling this a complexity wall. It's really going to be something ongoing that we're going to have to deal with, and we have to figure out ways to manage around it. And the only way to do it is to the point that Paul made, have a purposeful approach to moving to multi-cloud, do the right planning, figure out how you're going to do it, create the cross-cloud services, and then create the management and operational practices that are going to be able to scalable without having to spend 3 or 4 times as much on operations.
I agree with David 100%. It is complex, and one of the big reasons why it's so complex is because they're all different. Everybody has similarly named services on their clouds, and even the hyperscalers, they're all different in how you implement what services are available. So what that means now, and I think we've all touched on this here a little bit. What that means now, they're kind of they're great. They're very powerful, but they're silos unto themselves. And with those silos, including what you have on premise as well, you're now adding that complexity times 5 or 10x for your developers, your operations people, your security people that have to secure this. I think that's why, as I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of our customers, I'm going all in 5 years, and we saw that, slow down a bit. And I think the reason why is because once they got into it, it was only then that they realized the differences in the complexity. And frankly, in many cases, it's a re-architecture of the application as well. Taking a monolithic application and stuffing it into a container is not a cloud-ready application.
Absolutely. As before, I agree with the other panelists. I think with this in the beginning, some people went all in really quickly that, hey, 5 years, we're going to get this done. It's going to be amazing. And now we're in a new, more mature era where folks have understood that, hey, there is a lot of complexity and I need to take a more measured approach. I need to take a more strategic approach, to Paul's point. And I think one piece that maybe has been eye-opening for various end user communities is the realization that in the beginning, there was a very strong groundswell of information available from vendors, from open source projects, from all kinds of folks who were stakeholders in this story, right? With, hey, here's the new world, let me show it to you. I think fast forward 5 years in, we're at an education level where end users understand, again, to Paul's point, that everyone is unique. Everyone has their specific problems. And so that means folks like us in CNCF foundations or open source projects or vendors or partners, we are all the supporting cast in the end user show. And ultimately, end users have to be making their decisions, bringing their own point of view. They cannot assign someone to take care of the problem for them. It's too complex, it's too special, and it's too business critical.
So to zero in on that complexity thing a little bit more, which I always find kind of funny about this particular debate is, companies who are torn between complexity and lock-in, like in terms of, you may want to go with multiple cloud providers to hedge your bets across different vendors. That introduces a ton of complexity. One way to manage that complexity is to adopt higher level managed services from those cloud providers, which in turn locks you in closer to their services. It seems like this thing kind of spirals, and I'm wondering, how people navigate these decisions. And I think one thing that's super interesting about enterprise tech in general is there is no one right answer in a lot of cases. The answer for different companies depends on their application needs and their business needs. But I'm curious from you folks, what you see out there in terms of how people navigate that question of, I want the hedge, I want the flexibility of using multiple providers, but wow, this is really hard and I need help.
I think there's a couple of approaches you can take. Number one, you can throw tools at it and figure out how to make AI ops and abstraction automation kind of remove a lot of the complexity from it. You still have the underlying lock-in as people binding their applications to native security, native governance, native scalability, all those sorts of things. And that has its own merits because in many instances you have to fix things in flight and you can't ask somebody to go make some major surgery on their existing applications and make it happen. So that ends up being the default for a lot of enterprises that are hitting this complexity wall. Overall, the larger solution, and Priyanka can probably chime in on this because there are organizations around it, the ability to get much more sophisticated with your architectures in dealing with the enabling technology. So using microservices and serverless technology and containers and container orchestration like Kubernetes to get a little wiggy with how the architectures are going to work and to provide you with the ability to run off a cross-cloud scenario, even in a federated scenario. And that seems to be moving forward. The problem with that is you're asking people to go do major surgery on their existing applications and also hire architects that kind of have another level of sophistication when it comes to deploying these things. That's going to work. It's going to be probably the more optimized solution than anything else, but it's going to be incredibly expensive. What's never going to be an option is just not doing anything and throwing people and dollars at it. And I'm seeing that occurring now, or even CIOs putting their foot down in terms of we're not moving to another cloud provider. I don't care what best of breed technology sits on that thing, but we're not going to run into our complexity wall and have to spend more money. And that ultimately is going to hinder innovation, hinder creativity, hinder productivity when these organizations. And right now, with disruption going on everywhere, that should be something that businesses are avoiding.
100% agree. I think, David, what you said, right, of any CIOs who are putting their foot down on, hey, we can't adopt anymore, that's a losing proposition. And I think it brings back to that same point of end users have to know that they are charting their own destiny here, and we're all different kinds of players here to support them. And something we've seen in CNCF land with cloud native projects is, when we think of complexity, it's not entering when you'd say, hey, should I consider another cloud? Actually, there is so much heterogeneity from way before, from different services you're using, what database you're using, what's the security layer, what is observability story. And it's very rare that you can use all services from one hyperscaler and be done with it. You may be doing a disservice to moving fast and building the best technology that way. So the complexity has arrived even when you don't have a very large multi-cloud footprint. And something that I'm seeing in the cloud native landscape work well, but it requires effort, is thinking from the control plane perspective. And that is something, even if you are predominantly on one cloud and have a little bit somewhere else, or even if you just have one cloud, has been super useful. So there's a project in CNCF called Crossplane. And the whole idea is to provide a higher level of abstraction, make it easier. And what we're starting to see, and this is all, kind of brand new, I wouldn't say this is mass adoption, but what we're starting to see things like folks will couple together a Crossplane with another project that we have called Backstage, which is basically a service catalog, service discovery tool, and then pair that with something like Argo or Flux, which are GitOps projects, and finally add in governance and policies with Open Policy Agent. So then you have sort of put together a situation where, regardless of how wide or different fragmented your multi-cloud sprawl may be, you are able to manage the heterogeneity and complexity in the various services that you're using. So that's something I've started to see as happening. But again, it's happening when end users are recognizing that, hey, we can't get out of this complexity issue. We can't say no to all new tools, technologies. We have to figure out some answers.
I mean, I agree with both of you, but I also think there's another step too. And the way I like to talk about this is I talk about an open source project versus a product. And, I've lived this for the last 21 years of my life here at Red Hat. So, I mean, it's the same thing that happened with Linux in the commercial world here, right? In that, there's three major Linux vendors, right? There's Red Hat, there's Canonical, and there's SUSE really out there. They're all the same, but in one way they come from the same upstream project, kernel.org for the kernel, but they're all different in how they build to come from the project to the product. They all choose different projects to surround the kernel. They all choose different development environments. They all choose different file systems to support. It's the same exact thing with containers and Kubernetes and all the pieces, and they all choose a different life cycle, what APIs to keep stable and not keep stable, things like that. And so I think that's another way too. I think people have to understand we almost did too good of a job in selling open source because there's a big confusion out there in a project versus a product. And they are very, very, very different because enterprises, as we all know, they don't move near the same rate that an upstream development community moves in. And so I think that's something to remember. And I think the other thing is more organizational as well as why we're in this. I don't think a lot of CIOs realize these differences early on, right? For one thing, I think, as I said, once they got into it, they started to see it. But they're also being driven by the businesses, and the businesses have many of their own developers in their own shop, and their main priority is get the application up, running, and out the door. And they're driving the strategy more and more. I see this more and more in big companies, and that's sort of another way that these multi-clouds just sort of happen. In many cases, the business gets to decide where they're going to start and run their project, and then they throw it over the wall to the CIO's organization to operate it and secure it for the rest of the time. So I think it's really complex in combination of technical issues and organizational issues, and in many cases political issues as well.
I think it's an interesting point about the open source, the project versus the product, and like that there are, a lot of projects within Priyanka's organization that promise to solve some of these issues and like can actually deliver on a lot of that. But managing an open source project within an enterprise is a difficult undertaking in and of itself. And so like it's this constant push and pull, I guess, that is interesting, that these solutions emerge, but then I had an editor once who told me we weren't allowed to call software solutions because software caused more problems than it has ever solved in the history of the industry. But I think that matters in this debate, where you're trying to manage, like you're wanting to adopt as flexible a posture as you can, but you can't run your organization ragged trying to manage that infrastructure. And I'm just curious if there are things that you've seen, with respect to, the way that cloud providers and startups and mature companies at this point are often offering more of these managed services around open source projects that aim to deliver on some of this promise. Is that working? Is that not working? Where do you see that?
Fastest growing segment of our business right now is, we have OpenShift obviously, but OpenShift as a managed service for a whole bunch of different reasons. One of the biggest reasons is talent. That we see many of our customers that just don't have enough talent in their IT shops to do this. They just want an application platform to build upon. They don't want to have to worry about taking that forward themselves and what version works with other version and all of that. So managed services, not only at the platform level, but even services we're now offering above it as well. We see that's the fastest growing segment in our business right now. And I think talent is probably, or lack thereof, is probably the biggest reason.
But then again, you've hitched yourself to that wagon once again as the customer, where you built your application so closely around these services that some of the flexibility you were valuing, you've had to make a trade-off there.
Well, you got to be really careful on which services you choose and with what application. It may be okay to have an application. I mean, I think I think David mentioned serverless earlier, right? You spin up a serverless container, that application's not going to run as it in its current without modification outside of that cloud provider. That may be okay for some applications, but you have to go in that consciously and not let it happen by accident.
Yeah, we're also seeing, recently the CNCF annual survey, like 79% of folks who were using Kubernetes were using a managed service. And so we definitely see what we call the going under the hood. And talent is absolutely one big reason. I think stage of company and what is the business priority is also really important. So I personally see a lot of younger companies actually just pick one ecosystem, pick one, provider and use majority of their services because they just got to ship and get out of the door, right? And it makes complete sense. As they are growing and time goes by, they get more successful. That's when I think more complexities come in, not just because like, hey, I acquired a company or that just heterogeneity, like it creeps in, right? A multi-cloud chooses you, as they say. I recently heard somewhere. And so that kind of happens in a company's life cycle over time, I think. And to Paul's point, it's okay. It's not the end of the world if you started off one place, had a little bit of a close tie-in somewhere. Over time, multi-cloud will find you, and you have to just stay on top of that strategy and know you are in the driver's seat and the decision maker throughout that journey. That's how I see it.
Those great responses. Anything to add?
So there's a couple of things, so let's assume we're down the road with multi-cloud, we're you either chose us or we chose it, but whatever, we're moving, we're committed. There's a couple of things that come up that I think all organizations have to think about with respect to multi-cloud. And one of them is costs, managing costs. One of them is security, managing security across different providers. And the other one we should talk about is the question of resiliency and whether or not this multi-cloud postures actually improve resiliency or if you just sort of, doubled your risk factor. So let's start with costs. How do organizations think about managing costs across multiple cloud providers? What are some of the things that mistakes they're prone to making or tips or tricks that they should really know about?
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a refocus on FinOps for the last couple of years and turning cost governance tools and the ability to have deep analytics in terms of what the usage works across different clouds. Even the more sophisticated clients that we have will also bring that into the legacy systems and monitor and manage those using the same metrics and configuration. And that does a couple of things. Number one, it becomes a budgetary issue because you can charge back the different organizations that are using more of those resources than they could, and really kind of everybody has a good accounting for how that's going to happen. But also people, I think only 80% of the costs that we see were ununderstood. So in other words, it's leaving things on and not using something in an optimized way and getting these huge cloud bills and getting these huge disk bills and even mapping that into the data centers and leveraging that through humans and how much training has to occur. You have to have metrics to, in essence, monitor that, move it forward. And I think that's the big discipline that's occurring these days. And not just throwing tools at it, but having talented individuals that are just associated with FinOps that have enough technical understanding to set up these monitoring models and set up these reports, put these budgets in place, and enforce these policies.
I think you hit the nail on the head, David, with enough, the people that are doing the analysis having enough technical understanding here, because there's a lot of hidden costs that they never think of. The development costs of 5 different silos, right? The operations costs. I mean, that's taken into account in many of the tools, all the tools, but even going deeper than that, and the security costs as well, right? I think we're just starting to look at that. I actually think it stems back to something I said: a difference in project versus product. People just said, well, Kubernetes is Kubernetes. So AKS is the same as EKS, which is the same as IKS. So it just all works, right? But once they get into it, they realize it's more work for those people I talked about, developers, security, operations, and others as well. So I think we're just starting to get there and really looking at the total cost model of what it takes.
Sorry about that. I just had the cleaners walk by, and I was like, "Come on, folks!" So I had to be off mic for a second. But I just wanted to say, yeah, I think the cost scenario or efficiency, it's resilient, all of those things, we are not at a place where we're commoditized enough to be optimizing for that in this moment. I don't think costs are optimal. I don't think people have it figured out where, they charge exactly right. And I think this is just a pain we all have to go through as we are in this journey of modernization and really utilizing cloud capabilities and different services to their best limits. So I think it would be unrealistic for anybody to expect that they're going to be the most efficient usage of capital and human resources possible in the endeavors we're talking about. And I think it's best to know that and plan accordingly. That's my recommendation.
The elephant in the room, of course, with multi-cloud and costs are egress costs, which obviously we've seen some movement on that over the last 6 months, but that still remains a primary concern of a lot of folks I talk to who are thinking about adopting these kinds of postures. It's just, moving data out of a cloud provider is expensive and arguably more expensive than it should be. Do you see any movement there with customers you talk to? Do you see any movement there with vendors you talk to? Or is there a realization that if multi-cloud is here and multi-cloud is here to stay, that's a problem that will need to be addressed?
Yeah, I think ultimately customers are leaving the data where it exists, closer to the applications, and they're just refraining from moving things out of the cloud. There's a performance reason not to do it as well, not just the cost reason. The cloud providers need to be a little bit more flexible in how that's done. I agree with you. It costs too much to remove my data from the cloud to put it into another system that's going to be needed, and also to transmit data to the cloud for that matter, because you pay for the network costs and things like that. There's always some sort of an upcharge that gets there. So a couple of things. Number one, when you architect these things, you typically assume that the data is going to remain bound to the application in the cloud where it exists. And the thing is, I would say that is a best practice, not because it always should be a best practice. We should do things that are optimal for the business, but because as soon as we get into that, we're going to get in some cost risks that we may not understand. And what I've also seen when suddenly the egress costs go up, over time, and that's starting to happen. So suddenly it was $1,000 a month, which was reasonable for a particular client. The next year, it's $10,000 a month for the additional data that they're looking to transmit. That won't scale. So the cloud providers need to be a little bit more flexible in this. But I think the customers right now in their defensive posture, and I would recommend this, leave the data as much as you can where it is and don't move it out of the cloud unless you absolutely have to.
So with respect to one of the second of the three multi-cloud things to watch out for, security. Security is obviously top of mind for anyone operating any kind of informational business in the 21st century. When you adopt a multi-cloud posture, you have more things to think about. How has that changed the equation for the companies and folks that you talk to? Do they feel they're able to improve security this way? Is it just a headache that you sort of take on and acknowledge you'll have to manage? Has there been anything notable over the past year or so in terms of tackling this problem that you've seen emerge?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think it's up to the vendors like us too, as well. I mean, we acquired a container security company called StackRox about 12 or 18 months ago, and the thought process there is you've got to secure right at the container, and we've got many security features built into our container. Our containers come from RHEL, so we typically pick up the security in hand. There's a lot more security than just at that level, but just at that level comes from RHEL, so you can pick up the security with that. But you've also got to secure it at the Kubernetes architecture and right at the container. So you're seeing a couple of things. You're seeing startups like StackRox was before we brought them in, starting to solve some of that problem. But you're also seeing the CIOs not having to, I hate to overuse the term, but architect for that too, as they look at their whole environment that's not behind their four walls anymore in their data center.
From our perspective, yes, it's much more complex with security once you introduce any complexity. And so that's just a fact. And from the CNCF point of view, our objective is, since the cloud CNCF projects are critical to this multi-cloud journey, and they're a very big part of the conversation, we need to make sure that our security practices are solid. And so there's a lot of investment that goes into security audits for each project, for especially the graduated ones. And then there are processes that maintainers have to follow as just part of being in the ecosystem. And that, to me, is us doing our part in this story. And then there's everybody, like Paul said, the vendors have their role to play, the end users have their thinking to do, the partners have to support the strategy around it. So I think everybody needs to bring their own doing their best to the scenario, and then that's how I think we all tackle it together.
Yeah, we're defining cloud security when it comes to multi-cloud as something that's systemic and cross-cloud first. So it has to be an overreaching set of services that you can leverage very much in a similar way, if not exactly the same way, across the clouds. It needs to be common identity directory that exists across the clouds, circumventing the heterogeneity. It needs to have identity access management encryption. Instead of doing that through one-off tools that are typically native to particular clouds, you're looking for the cross-cloud features. And the problem with that is that it's difficult. It's easy to find native tools, within the particular cloud providers that will provide those services. But finding something cross-cloud and getting into these true security managers that are able to operate efficiently right now, that's a growing area. That's a big thing I think that the vendors should address. We have some services and some things that work, but not necessarily complete solutions. But people are standing up multi-cloud. I think the worst you can do is leverage cloud native tools in these little silos to support these little security silos. Everything should be considered holistic, should work not only across your public cloud providers, but your private clouds as well as your legacy systems. And that blows people's minds because we're used to having security as something that's very tactical. But unless we do that, that won't scale. And we're going to get in trouble pretty quick.
It seems like the whole notion of the shared responsibility model when it comes to security just grows even that more complex in a multi-cloud world. Especially if the vendors, aren't necessarily the best of friends and don't always, haven't always reached the same degree of collaboration that, we've seen with security software companies in other industries. It seems like we're not quite there yet in cloud. And I mean, maybe you all disagree with that, but that's sort of where it looks like from my standpoint.
No, I agree. And I look to the third-party providers that are not the big cloud providers to provide the solutions there. I think that the reality is if you live in your own walled garden, everything's going to be translated in the way in which you define the world. These are much more holistic solutions. I think the most important thing about multi-cloud is not necessarily is going to be in a cloud. It's this cross-cloud services, security being the main one. And we have to get that right. And as I mentioned earlier, the stuff won't scale. We try to do this in one-off ways. We're just going to paint ourselves into a corner. It's going to cost too much. It's going to break. We're going to get breached.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
I think it does help that I think it's this year, that there's been this huge renewed focus on security, right? With the government getting involved, with the White House making very clear statements. I think all of that will push us faster in this direction that we need to go in.
I mean, if everyone is focused on supply chain security, I think that does sort of help across the industry.
It just helps. Yeah, exactly.
Totally. So one other thing I wanted to make sure on that, the last of the three things I had mentioned was the resiliency question, which is always a fascinating one. I don't know about you folks, but I, after the last AWS outage in December, I probably got 400 emails the next day pitching multi-cloud solutions. And, like, I think that's a pretty common experience across, no matter who has an outage, no matter what happens. Like that's a fairly common experience. Multi-cloud resiliency, though, is a much more difficult problem than it might sound. And I would love to hear from each of you sort of about how, I'm sure there are plenty of customers or partners that you've all talked to who see an outage and are like, well, we've got to hedge our bets. We've got to be careful. We've got to make sure we don't go down, and then getting back to the complexity question, you're just introducing so much more involved there. So I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit more how you think about multi-cloud for resiliency, and even really if that's a thing, if that's something you can actually pull off.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's pragmatically not a thing. It's not something that's easy to pull off, and it's going to be way too expensive. I also got the same calls after the outage, and the reality is they were looking to do an active on different cloud brands. So one cloud brand backs up another. The problem is if you're deploying and running software in those environments, those are still siloed standalone things, whether it's a primary as a backup. They're going to have to be developed. They're going to have to be maintained. They're going to have to be secured. And therefore, you're almost, and certainly almost doubling your cost of that particular application. So given that bill and the amount of outages that actually occur, typically that's not going to be functional for most organizations, not cost effective. And so that would be, you can do anything with enough money and time. Typically, that's not going to be something you should do.
We see some of the banks doing it, but as you said, they can afford, in many cases, to spend the dollars that it takes to do it. But it's it is a difficult problem.
Absolutely, yeah, you're spot on. It's like the more financial services are the ones where you can see some evidence of this stuff. Fidelity is a great example. They have a case study with the CNCF where they talk about how they built a platform which helps them being able to move things around a lot easier, et cetera. But realistically, for most people out there, application portability is not a thing when you think about moving from cloud to cloud. It's not like I'm just gonna, AWS has an outage, lift and shift in a second, it's done. That's just not true. We're not at that level of commoditization is how I see it. So I think multi-cloud resiliency is a bit far off into the future.
Well, we can, with our products, we give that ability to move because it's the same set of containers and infrastructure that runs on both. The problem is, as we talked about earlier, is the data. And and that's one of the big problems of it. I think you're right, David. You said earlier, you recommend, build where the data is. And that's what a lot of people have done. So being able to run an application anywhere, it certainly solves a lot of problems. But if it's a very, very data-heavy application, you've got another whole set of problems.
Do you think it's possible to achieve multi-cloud resiliency? With the current set of tools that we have and the current industry situation that we have, so many people seem to want to do it, and it makes sort of a certain type of sense, I guess. But obviously, it's a very complex problem, and in a world that's going to get only more interconnected and only more dependent on some of these systems. I'm kind of curious if you think that's even an achievable goal.
We'll get there. I think we'll get there because I think hybrid is here to stay, right? Hybrid multi is here to stay. It's not going away. So that fosters innovation, fosters, startups, all kinds of things. So yeah, I'm very confident we'll be able to do this.
Yeah, and I think that the best way to approach it is going to be containerization, microservices, cloud native features, and be able to replicate those environments on different cloud environments. Paul alluded to that earlier. And I think that can be done. The problem is we can't take every application on our portfolio, and most enterprises it's going to be 10,000 applications, and move it to that sort of an architecture without a large bill that they're unwilling to pay. Like I said, with enough time and money, I can do anything well. And that's going to take a tremendous amount of time and money currently. We'll eventually get there, I think, to Paul's point.
And I sort of wanted to start to wrap up here with one sort of question looking a little bit forward to what you were saying about how multi-cloud is here and hybrid cloud is here, and how that looks for companies over the next few years. I think we've heard some interesting chatter about companies that are maybe rethinking the idea of being on the cloud at all and managing their own applications in their own data centers. Throwback, just to do it in old school. And I don't know how realistic that really is. I don't know how many people are actually talking about doing that. But I'm curious for your all thoughts. Will we think of multi-cloud as we define it kind of right now? We're talking about different cloud providers. Hybrid cloud, we're talking about maybe one cloud provider and your own data centers. Does the distinction go away at some point down the road where you'll always have a mix of different operating environments? Some stuff you want to keep close to you for data or for regulatory reasons, some stuff that just makes too much sense or cost-wise to run in the cloud. And then the question of how companies think about this as they mature. I don't think any startup is really going out there and buying tons of servers. Right. But there comes a point in time where maybe you start to think a little bit differently about that as you understand the needs of your application. So sort of thinking about that broadly over the next few years, how do you see the silos between multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, on-prem, different cloud providers breaking down or sort of merging together?
I think it's done. I think the distinction has gone away. Every customer, I talk to customers all day long. They're all hybrid multi. And some may, like as we said earlier, some may not quite know it yet, but we do see people actually moving applications back to on-premise, but they want to do it in such a way that they take advantage of cloud native development. So they're still coming back in a container environment, in a Kubernetes environment, et cetera, effectively building their own cloud to take advantage of that rapid development, DevOps cycle, all of that. So we do see that, but I don't see the customers I see doing that. They're not abandoning the public cloud. They're just actually, I think, in many cases, getting more educated on the requirements of their applications and putting them in the right places, but still want the principles that the cloud type development brings to them.
Yeah, I like to say there's no shame in repatriation of applications. And over the last 10 years since the cloud hype came and went, we've kind of realized that we moved a lot of these applications and data sets, and we're starting to move them to more optimized platforms. When I define multi-cloud, I include legacy systems, traditional systems, public cloud, private clouds, in that architectural mix, because it has to be there, to the other panelist's point. And your ability to manage this holistically, include those into your management, security, governance infrastructure is on the critical path. If you don't do that, it's not going to work. If you have different siloed infrastructures, I don't care if it's something that's been around for 40 years, that thing's not going to go under the same managerial rigor, and you're going to get in trouble, and it's going to cost too much.
Yeah, I think to the other panelists' point, the lines are blurry when you're saying what is hybrid cloud versus multi-cloud. Just in my own personal opinion, when I think hybrid, I'm like, oh, hybrid has everything. It has, the potential of on-prem. It has, it has your own cloud. It has public providers. Throw it all in there, really. And I think a little bit of what the chatter that you mentioned, you might be hearing, I think is a sign of end users getting more sophisticated, really understanding their system, their applications, their unique situation better than anyone else, and starting to be more opinionated. that will, to what Paul was saying, to Paul's point, and I think also David's, I don't think that means a complete abandonment of cloud providers. That's not going to be useful for them. They're just going to be much more smarter and opinionated about how they do things. That's my perspective.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much to our panel. It was a great conversation, and really appreciated all your thoughts and insights on what is a very complex and fast-changing topic. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to sign up for the Protocol Enterprise newsletter, where you can also stay informed about upcoming events similar to this one. Thanks again for everyone's time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a
Thanks.
pleasure.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.